Welcome to Supply Chain 4.0, All You Need to Know, a 5-part podcast series powered by Procurious and sponsored by IBM Watson Supply Chain. With so many dynamic changes happening in the supply chain profession, are you struggling to keep up with the latest trends? Never fear, because in this series we've got it covered as we're addressing how to define where your supply chain begins and ends, how blockchain will improve supply chain visibility, the latest technologies impacting your supply chain, and how to make supply chain management your organisation's competitive advantage. I'm speaking with Tom Linton, Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Officer from Flex, on the topic, where does your supply chain begin and end? So Tom, let's get straight into it. How do you define where the supply chains begin and end? Obviously, we've had the traditional view, and it's interesting to know probably that the term supply chains only really evolved in the 1980s, I think someone told me, which was a very structural view. I guess the evolving view now is that we're part of an ecosystem and we really have to be a lot more dynamic and agile in the way we think of supply chains. And of course, now the evolving view and what this whole podcast series is about, which is 4.0, and what will that mean? So that's just a bit of context to give you some little direction on where we're thinking here at Procurious. But please tell us, you're the guru, how do you define where a supply chain begins and ends?
So for me, supply chain is all about the movement of material from suppliers through the creation of a product to a customer. So it's all about movement, and it's all about material in motion, and all about the acquisition through the movement of material. So for me, supply chain end-to-end is exactly what I have under my organization, where it's all about how I acquire it from the suppliers, how it goes through our factories, how it becomes finished goods, and then how it gets obviously to an end consumer. So it's all that material in motion is how I like to look at it. And if you think about a supply chain, it's really all about the white space between the nodes. It's all about how that compression of material movement actually occurs, and velocity is key. So it's all about the speed by which it moves. So for me, end-to-end really is from the genesis of that purchase order to a supplier all the way through a consumer.
And how do you think it's going to evolve?
Well, I think the first thing that's going to happen is if we plan backwards, let's just hypothetically say we're looking at the year 10 years out. So we're looking at, say, 2029. And if we look backwards, what we're going to see is gradually the creation of autonomous supply chains, or supply chains that actually are communicating with each other, and how devices and materials in that supply chain start to communicate with each other. Connectivity is all possible now. The technology exists for this to happen. So we're going to see transactions being eliminated as blockchains grow. We're going to see the transformation of supply chains from something that requires a lot of people in transactional jobs and execution jobs to really people who are focused on design, technology, and solutions of how companies actually go through that process of acquisition and fulfillment, rather than spending a lot of time and effort on transactions as we do today, from creation of purchase orders to managing receipts and payments and all those things. As things like blockchain start to take over, and as autonomous materials, things start to communicate with each other inside the supply chain, we're going to see this evolution towards autonomous, and that's what I see definitely happening, in a 10-year horizon.
And so I know a lot of people look to you and Flex as the benchmark. Why don't you you're happy to give us a little bit of color about what happens at Flex. So when you talk about your current supply chain and how that's going to evolve, do you mind sharing with our listeners, the current state and what it's like to work in supply chain at Flex and how that might evolve?
Yeah, so the biggest problem we had when I first looked at it at Flex 8 years ago was the challenge of visibility, because if you think of your supply chain, the biggest problem you have is, where is my stuff? I can't see it. I don't know where it is at a certain period of time. So what we did is we created something called Flex Pulse. And Flex Pulse really is a way by which we visualize our data. If you were to visit a Flex Pulse center, we have 9 of them around the world. They're not really control towers. A lot of people talk about control towers in supply chain, but personally I'm not in favor of the term. I prefer to call it a flow tower because the purpose of a supply chain is actually to move material and keep it moving rather than control it. So we have 94 applications that are actually visualized in Flex Pulse, and these 94 applications actually give us clear understanding of where the material is at any given period of time. So, for example, I know it from the beginning of a lead time all the way through what my minimum order quantities are in my factories, what my inventories are in different stages from raw material to WIP to finished goods. And I understand exactly what my purchase order profile looks like, and I actually can understand, what materials I might be have shortages growing in, or I have too much of. So this idea of visibility as a way to increase your velocity is really important. One of the analogies I like to use is if you're driving your car down the highway and you actually don't know how fast you're going, it's the same as having a supply chain without actually understanding what your speed is, or not understanding what your petrol or your fuel capacity is. So visibility in the tools that we need in supply chain really enhance our ability to move our materials quickly and efficiently. Without tools and without some of the visualization tools that exist today, and a lot of the tools that I'm talking about have only been created in the last 5 years. These are tools that allow data to not just be in spreadsheet form, to actually be shown in pie charts and histograms and different forms of visualization that humans can actually understand and interact with. We're at the age of human-machine interface, where humans and machines are doing a lot of interaction together. Think of your phone or your iPad or whatever. And this kind of interaction with data is what we see as the current time frame of maybe the next 5 years. After that, through machine-to-machine APIs and through the ability of software to actually communicate, what's going to happen is a lot of the human-machine interface isn't going to be necessary. If an inventory is too low, for example, applications talking to each other will automatically reset the minimum order quantity, for example. It'll automatically increase orders that are extending lead time, or it'll automatically increase the number of purchase orders if the number of quantity is too low. So what I see is this kind of transformation occurring, and that's what we're doing at Flex. That's what we're building at Flex Pulse, is step by step toward that future.
Wow, 94 applications, and it seems like into a very visual type dashboard that you've used. It sounds like there's been a lot of benefits in gaining that transparency. How has your team managed that? And I guess how have you as a leader managed that? Because we talk a lot at Procurious about beating the bots and how we've got to use our humanness to sort of survive in the 4.0 regime, if you like. So, could you give us a bit of insight about how you've managed that change with your team and how you see the roles within your supply chain organization evolving?
Well, if I go back again, 6-8 years ago, the problem was most people have a lot of data. In fact, I think anybody listening to your broadcast would know that, there's a lot of data. Nobody suffers from a lack of information. The problem is how that data is actually utilized and positioned so that people can actually digest it and act on it is the key. So what I really did was I had a supply chain solutions team, which really was a team working on things like master data, working on things like how part numbers and nomenclatures are created. And what I did is I just repositioned it as a mission. The mission was really to increase the flow of the supply chain. So if you have a river and you want to increase the flow, you don't want to have a lot of locks or things or dams that slow it down. You want to be able to release it. And so once people understood that the key secret to supply chain was increasing its speed, I tell people all the time that my definition of supply chain is the theory of supply chain. The speed is the theory of everything. If you don't have speed in your supply chain, you're not improving your supply chain. So this concept of flow and visibility in order to increase flow became really the rallying cry that everybody in the organization had to get around. Once everybody got around that and understood what we were trying to achieve in terms of speed and flow and visibility as a way to get there, then everybody got aligned behind how to do that.
I love it. Speed, flow, great. Well, look, why don't we quickly change gears, given we're talking about speed, and if we could just touch on ethical supply chains. Obviously, this is a big issue for people working in the profession. They want to make sure that their supply chains are ethical and that we're, procuring with purpose. Also, obviously, consumers also want to know that their supply chains are sustainable and ethical. What are you doing at Flex with regards to supply chain transparency and guaranteeing that ethical quality to your customers?
But what's interesting about Flex's business model is we actually build other people's products, and I call it, we raise other people's children, because basically whether it's an HP printer or a phone or some device that we're making for a medical or automotive, each one of those devices is actually being built for another product. So it's very important for us to have transparency in our supply chain. So by increasing transparency as a virtue or a concept, you actually improve the sustainability of your supply chain. So, for example, one of the big issues today is provenance, or provenance. Where exactly is the material originating from? What materials are in it? Is it complying with the UN Global Compact? Is it complying with the EICC in the case of electronics? Does it actually perform and do the function that it says that it is designed to do? And these kinds of issues are not like an option anymore. I don't know of a single customer that we're working with where sustainability is not a requirement. In Flex, we call it world citizenship. We move actually past the concept of just sustainability and call it a responsibility, not just a sustainability. It's actually a responsibility as a world citizen. So if you really want to drive and improve the state of the world, you have to participate in it everywhere, every country. You have to have, no matter where you're producing it, you have to abide by similar standards. And your customers and the consumers in this case, so who actually buy the product, are expecting that more and more every year. I can't think of one year that's gone by where consumers have gone backwards in their expectation. It's always forward. So this is a continuous march towards making sure that transparency is there. Blockchain, for example, as a technology, is going to have a big impact on this area.
I was just going to raise that, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to make a big impact because it's going to provide increasing amounts of transparency. And also documentation in this sense, because, in a blockchain basically is irrefutable data that exists forever. So if somebody ever had a question about where it came from or who did it or why they did it, that would be the evidence that they would need, and that would form the basis of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm glad you touched on blockchain because I thought provenance is the blockchain's the perfect solution for the provenance question, and as you said, documentation to support that. Now, look, you're an author. You co-authored a book entitled The Living Supply Chain. So I thought for our listeners, it would be great if you could just talk through the meaning behind a living supply chain and some of the key elements of the book that you wrote.
Well, the key thing that we did with Flex Pulse was we recognized that information has a time value. So if you think about information, really, it's the importance of real-time information versus latent information. So, back to my example of the car, right? If your speedometer is telling you how fast you were going yesterday, that's not going to help you today. If you're driving down the highway and your fuel tank says, last week you had enough fuel, it doesn't help you today. So the importance of real-time live information is really important. So the subtitle of the book is The Living Supply Chain, the Evolving Imperative of Real-Time Information. So what that means is that real-time data, real-time information in a supply chain is now required for supply chains to to perform at their optimum level. And we talk about supply chain as a profession as one that's evolving. If you compare other professions, look at a lawyer where they have bar examinations or barristers in the case of the UK. If you talk about a CFO, either they have some certifications in accounting. If you talk about different functions and different things, that supply chain is a little different than that. We can get certified at certain levels, but supply chain has a borderless feeling to it. I guarantee you probably talked to enough supply chain people, but they're different. Everybody has a different scope of responsibility, a different scope of practice. My scope of practice in supply chain is different than my peers. They might do something totally different than what I do. And that's not true when you talk to accountants. That's not true when you talk to people in the legal profession. And so our job is much more fluid and much more evolving. So the other thing we talk about in the book is the evolving nature of supply chain. And it's live, it's intelligent, it's networked. It's about velocity, and it's about good. So LIVING is actually an acronym. And this concept of this evolutionary, almost the parallel we draw in the first book is almost biological, right? I mean, if you think about a supply chain, it's almost biological in nature. It's changing, it's evolving, it's a living thing. It's not a static thing that's not changing. And I think that's very important for people to understand that are in the profession and people who are looking at the profession from the outside. Because a lot of people, when you talk to people who are not familiar with supply chain and you use the word supply chain, they look at you like, oh, okay, that sounds complicated. But they really don't know what it is, because for FedEx, it's a different supply chain than it is for Maersk, than it is for a Flex, that it is for a bank, or it is for somebody else. So this is, I think, the key message in the first book. This nature of supply chain is being very different and very, very variable and very changeable, and why we have to focus on truth and concepts like speed and velocity and visibility and things that are kind of deeper truths that represent what we do.
Wow, I love it. A high-velocity, borderless profession. That's very inspiring for a lot of the professionals out there, Tom. So why don't we leave it at that today? Thank you so much for sharing your views and insights on Supply Chain 4.0. We really appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate it very much. I enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Supply Chain 4.0, All You Need to Know, a podcast series powered by Procurious and sponsored by IBM Watson Supply Chain. If you'd like more related content, please check out the Supply Chain Pros group on Procurious.